Rabbi Glazer wanted me to begin my sermon by saying that you are going to see the pictures of our summer vacation. And you are. Hoidunanash, a small town in Hungary outside of Debrecen. Hoidunanash was the mythical town that my father-in-law, Stephen Hornstein, grew up in. He tells wonderful stories of running the streets of a strong Jewish community, being brought up as an Orthodox Jew, but being the first to go to gymnasia, the actual public school. His father, a strong Zionist, believed in the ethics and ethical ways. Interfaith dialogue is a man who he revered. We found the cemetery in Hoidunanash and found Frank's great-grandfather's headstone, Avraham Yosef Hornstein in Hebrew letters. It's very powerful when you are a child of Holocaust survivors, because Frank's grandparents do not have graves. His aunt and uncles are not buried in individual graves of integrity and devotion. But his great-grandparents are. And it was powerful as the five of us stood in front of this grave and together said Kaddish. We took our 3 children on a legacy trip this summer, once in a lifetime trip. They all seemed to be home, which was a surprise. And we knew that this was something we had to do. 5 Hornsteiner, my son is appalled right now, and he's here. Hornsteiner, it is a street that my mother-in-law grew up in, at Lvov, Poland. In the time that she grew up, it's Lviv, Ukraine today. We went to her apartment house. Her father owned this apartment house and the one next door that her grandparents lived in. My mother-in-law never went back to Lvov. My father-in-law went back to Hoidunanash and took his children a number of times. But Frank last year was the first Hornstein to return to Lvov, and then took us this year. This is inside. This is the apartment house, the apartment that my mother-in-law grew up in. The stairs are the same stairs that she climbed up and down, I'm sure, to go to school, to practice her piano, to run next door to her grandparents' house. And we saw the door of the basement that she would have to hide in when she heard there was going to be a raid to pick up Jews. This was a legacy trip, a trip where our children not only learned the Holocaust stories of which they had been told with the words of my in-laws, but they also learned about the life they had before and what was so important about that as well. When we returned from our trip, a New York Times article said that when children are given the narrative of their families, they are more resilient. Dr. Duke from Emory University did research on this. He took 4 dozen families and asked the children 20 questions basic questions about their family. Do you know where your parents went to high school? Do you know something wonderful that's happened in your family, a story, and something that is traumatic and horrible? Do you know that? They found out that the children who could answer more of the 20 questions than others were more resilient, had a sense that they were part of something bigger and that it would be okay. They did this research in the summer of 2011. And so when 9/11 happened, they went back to the same 4 families, and they asked the children about 9/11. The ones who knew more about their families were truly not as traumatized as the ones who knew less. Jim Collins, from Good to Great, understands this idea of a family narrative. He says that in order to be great, actually corporate America has accepted this idea and given a narrative, core value, a core story. The Pentagon has done the same thing. The Pentagon, instead of breaking a new soldier down and then trying to build them back up, they actually understand that if this new enlistee understands the history of the unit that they are serving, that they understand why they are a part of the armed services, then they truly have a stronger sense of self. So if the Pentagon and if corporate America can talk about a narrative, then what is our Jewish narrative? What is our Jewish narrative for the next generation, for Generation X and Y and Z and Millennium? What is that narrative? We, those of us who are in our 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, we have a narrative. We got it down. They want to kill us. We survived. Let's eat. Danielle Hartman calls it the death narrative. And we just eat it up, don't we? I do. Being in Minneapolis, we are told of the anti-Semitism here in this city, and there is now literature, Minneapolis Jews and Employment, 1920s, not a good story. But we, in so many ways, feel strengthened by that story, those of us who grew up with the death narrative. We feel a sense of pride, even in the oppression and discrimination. It is part of who we are. Because the death narrative tells us that being a Jew in the United States means that a Holocaust can happen here. It tells us that to beware, that we are constantly hiding behind something, even though it might feel differently. 40 years ago today, the Yom Kippur War, I was in 9th grade. For some of you, that might seem young. For others, it feels really like I'm old. 9th grade, and walking into the sanctuary of Sher Emeth in St. Louis, Missouri, there was a buzz. Everybody was afraid. People were getting airplane tickets to fly to Israel in order to help out. People wanted to do something because our narrative was that Israel was in the midst of everyone who hates her, and that people were attacking her, and that is what was happening. It is true. It was true. And we hold on to it. And then, as United States and North American Jews, when it no longer felt like something could happen to us at any minute. We started looking at, instead of those who wanted to destroy us from the outside, we began to get worried about those who want to destroy us from the inside. We talked about Jewish continuity. Remember that? We were so worried, assimilation and interfaith marriage, that death was for sure going to happen in the next generation. Well, it truly is a reminder for us that the Yom Kippur War, here is Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir, caught off guard 40 years ago today. That narrative is ours, and it's important. But that narrative isn't working anymore. 20 and 30-year-olds are done with that narrative. It makes them feel defensive. It makes them feel like they're being coerced. It makes them feel like Judaism is doomsday. The oy vey and oy gewaltz, it's not working. And so we need to change the narrative. Not in any way forget what has happened, but we have to lighten it up a bit. Because why? Because our children grew up in a very different world than we did. Let's just remember, we had to wait and watch Charlie Brown's Christmas. They got Rugrats Passover. Their life was reflected on television in cartoons. Every year there was a new one that came up. It wasn't the same old one. And then here, Hanukkah. Their lives are constantly being reinforced by the mass media, something we did not have. And so they think Judaism is cool. Jerry did a really good thing, right? He helped us normalize Jewish neuroses. And then now Jon Stewart. He makes it cool to be Jewish because he laces all of his comic relief and interpretation of the news with his Judaism. You see, this is where our 20s and 30s get their news coverage. He makes it cool to be Jewish. And Israel, it's not the everyone hates us scenario. Stephen Cohen, a sociologist, tells us that actually for 20s and 30s, Israel can sometimes be more of the problem. It's not looked at as security. But when they go on birthright, they have a very different Israel than I went when I was 17. There weren't restaurants and bars. There wasn't the nightlife that clearly these people are experiencing. It's a different world they have grown up in. Not only the technology, but the reality of what they understand the definition of being Jewish is all about. So here, we're at a crossroads. What does it mean to give the Jewish narrative to the next generations? You see, Yosef Yerushalmi, a professor at Columbia, said that we cannot change our history. Our history is irreversible. But how we understand our history for the future, that can be changed like nothing else. So do we give the next generations the narrative of fear, or do we give them the narrative of openness and love? and understanding and pride. You see, the great generation were members of synagogues because it was their civic duty. We, as baby boomers, became members of synagogues because we needed to educate our children and we needed bar bat mitzvah. But 20s and 30s, they're wondering, do they have to belong at all? And so this synagogue is the absolute right place to have this conversation and to change course. The synagogue is the place where Jews come together, and if we can be open, we can invite the next generations to see the possibilities of what Judaism is all about. So there's a few things that I think are the answers. One, the death narrative needs to be turned down a bit. And we need to amplify the deep well of understanding and text and meaning of Judaism. This is a generation who looks at the world and sees the uncharted territory. They're excited by that. They want to know what it means to be pioneers, whether it's through technology or in the field of their interests. They want to be pioneers. We have the narrative on being pioneers. Remember, we left Egypt and went towards the promised land. We understand the creation of the modern state of Israel. Pioneering is in our blood. It is who we are. It is in our DNA. And we just have to connect that next generation to the strength of Judaism and Jewish text. We have to go beyond our four walls. We have to greet and meet young people. There's a rabbi who was hired, and they said, don't ever walk into the synagogue. I want you to go to Starbucks. I want you to go to Apple stores. I want you out of here to talk to the 20s and 30s. We need to go where they are in order to bring them in. There are so many possibilities, and I don't know all the answers, but I hope that you will come with us at Temple Israel as we begin to explore the possibilities to bring those 20s and 30s here and to give them a Jewish narrative that makes sense to them. That's important. This is not the first or only time that a generation seems a bit stymied about the future. Moses, who went up to Mount Sinai, he too was stymied by the future generations. He goes up to Mount Sinai to bring the Torah down, the Midrash says, and God is taking God's time. Moses says, God, what are you doing? I need to take the Torah down. God says, just wait a minute. I am affixing crowns on the letters. Moses says, why? Why do you have to go to such detail? He says, oh, God says, you will know that in the future there will be a teacher. His name will be Rabbi Akiva, and he will interpret not only every letter, but each of these crowns. Moses says, where is he? Show me. So God says, turn around. He turns around and he finds himself in the 8th row of Rabbi Akiva's classroom. Rabbi Akiva is teaching, and Moses, does not understand a thing. He doesn't understand what's happening. He feels so deflated because he doesn't get it. And then all of a sudden, a student raises his hand in Rabbi Akiva's classroom and says, how do you know that to be true, Rabbi Akiva? And Rabbi Akiva says, because Torah was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Whatever Judaism is going to look like in the future, those of us in certain age categories might not understand it, but it is okay. They take Judaism seriously. It just isn't the Judaism we knew. So, what we can do now is open our minds and our hearts to not only give the death narrative, but to give a narrative that has a wellspring of love and learning and laughter. And then, when we find ourselves in the 8th row in their classrooms, we sit and we listen. Shana Tova.
Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Chaneinu v'Haneinu, ki ein banu ma'asim, aseh imanu, tzedakah v'chesed, aseh imanu, tzedakah v'chesed, ve'hoshienu, Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Chaneinu v'Haneinu, ki ein banu ma'asim.
We begin the conclusion of our service with the Aleinu on page 282. Please rise.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר וראשית, שהוא נוטה שמיים ויוצר ארץ, ומושב יקרו בשמיים ממעל, ושכינת עוזו גבבי מרומים, O Eloheinu Einot, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך.
Kaddish is on page 284.